The evolving world driven by sustainability necessitates and demands businesses to adapt for their success. Essential for this adaptation are streamlined, just and unbiased regulations that ensure a balanced global landscape, enabling businesses to navigate necessary transitions. This session will explore the establishment of global standards to harmonize developmental and sustainability objectives. And I'd like to now invite onto the dais our panelists, Mr. Bernard Looney, the Chief Executive Officer, BP UK, Mr. Puneet Renjan, the Deputy Chairperson, Supervisory Board of SAP SE USA, Mr. Marcello Beher, the Vice President, Sustainability and Group Affairs, Natura and Company, Brazil, Mr. Arunava Mojumdar, Chester Naramore Dean, Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability, Jay Precourt, Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Energy Science and Engineering and Senior Fellow, Precourt Institute for Energy and Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And to moderate and be in conversation with our panelists, we've got the CEO, E.L. Rothschild, and founder and co-chair of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism UK, Ms. Lynn Forrester D. Rothschild.
Thank you.
We also have with us Mr. Sanjeev Puri, Vice President, CII. It's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know it's been a long day, and you've been very patient with many topics. The topic of this conference is, or this panel, is important in relation to the earlier panel that we had on financing the climate transition. And just like the earlier panel, I am incredibly honored, and we are all very fortunate to have this incredible group of people to, again, delve into what do we need to do when we talk about financing the energy transition or the transition to a world where business is responsible not only for profit, but also for its treatment of people and planet. And the reason standardizations matter is sort of encapsulated in the words of the famous management guru, Peter Drucker, in the 50s, who said, if you can't manage it, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's really important when we live in a world where we want financing to follow companies that are profitably solving the problems of people and planet. How do we have any kind of standard like we have for financial results? The GAAP standard or the IFRS standard. Don't forget that in the 1930s, before the crash, there was no standard financial accounting. You could report revenue, you could report losses according to your own rules. And then with the Great Depression, governments stepped in and said, financial reporting matters, the world needs to have transparency and standards. Now we live in a world where it's saying, actually, we want to be able to measure how companies take care of the environment, how they take care of their social responsibilities, how they govern themselves. But we're left without a way to measure it. And that's the topic that we're covering. That concept became a term starting in 2005 at the United Nations, when I think without really expecting it would become, take on a life of its own, the United Nations coined ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as measurements that the world had to take heed of. And flash forward, we've had, according to Bloomberg, $35 trillion has been invested in something that has a, quote, ESG connection. There are over 836 funds that say they're ESG. But underneath that nice banner, there's been a mad dash of ESG rating regimes. The B20 India team that did the paper that led to the recommendations that will go to the G20 said that there are something like 600 schemes out there. I'm on the board of a company and was told that there are 72 surveys that we receive every year from different groups who want different kinds of information. This has created a nightmare in trying to deal with something which is very important, like how do you differentiate companies according to their treatment of people and planet? So it has been a nightmare. It's created an alphabet soup. If you forget about the 600 that are out there, is it GRI? Do you do SASB? Do you do TCFD? Do you do CDP? I mean, there are prominent standards that companies feel obligated. So what we're going to talk about is how do we get away from this fractured data? How do we put companies in a place where they can report transparently, but it isn't overly onerous? And by the way, those onerous requirements are particularly onerous on SMEs, MSMEs, and the Global South, which we will talk about. So we don't want to create we need standardization in order to achieve the objective we want. The objective we want is we want a way to measure the way that companies are treating their people and their planet in a meaningful, material, comparable way. That's what we're trying to do. So we're going to explore the ins and outs of what's happening and what we think should happen. And so with that, Bernard Looney, if I could turn to you, and if you could tell us how BP sees its best ESG presentation, if we're going to stick with that word.
Well, thank you, Lynn, and good afternoon, everyone. And as I did this morning, for those of you who maybe weren't here, I just want to thank Lynn and congratulate her on her leadership in this whole area. She's founded the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, which is an extraordinary organization that is bringing about change on so many dimensions, and it would not have happened were it not for Lynn's vision and her courage and the dedication of enormous time that you do. So, Lynn, thank you. Maybe a few words around what a good reporting standard or mechanism might look like from the point of view of a company like BP. I would start by saying that we obviously fully support the concept of transparency, the ability to understand the environmental, the social, the governance risks and opportunities of any company are a factor, an important factor in making a decision around an investment opportunity, and therefore we should be transparent around that, and therefore we welcome that. However, I'd just quickly take you through 4 things that we think are important in any such scheme. The first is something that I think we would all recognize is around simplicity, or I would argue usefulness. If something is not simple, it runs a risk of not being useful to the people who want it. And I look at the EU CSRD, one of these standards that's coming out, and I just thought it would be helpful to just quote one element of what they are asking for, just to give you a sense of what I think is the complexity in this. So this is a standard that's going to require a company like ours to report over 1,000 data points covering the following scope, and I shall just read it very briefly. A company's actual or potential, positive or negative, impacts on people or the environment, over the short term, the medium term, the long term, including those connected with the undertaking's own operations, including its upstream and downstream value chains, including through its products, including through its services, as well as through its business relationships. Now, I won't repeat it to make the point, but I think all of us would agree that's a minefield, you could argue. That's a huge scope to report against. Hugely complex. Is it going to be useful? Point number one. The second is around equivalence. For us, we're headquartered in the UK. The ISSB will likely be taken up in the UK. We have operations in Europe. We will have the CSRD in Europe. And we have operations obviously in the United States, so we will have the SEC guidance. This is where we want to have what's called substituted compliance. We should, we believe, have to report against one of those standards, not all three. We can, of course, do that. I think we will possibly end up having to do that. I don't think that's going to help people who are trying to understand what our actual performance is in these areas if they're having to read three different descriptions and reports against the same set of subjects. The third is around directive. We believe that such standards should not be directive. They should be about disclosure. And here language matters. If we want to compare a company's emissions profile in the future against a 1.5 degree curve, there is a difference in language between disclose how you compare to the 1.5 degree line versus disclose how you will meet the 1.5 line. The latter is directive, the former is disclosure. And the fourth and final thing that we would look for, Len, in this space, and I'm going to, as you did this morning, quote Chandra here, our chair for the B20. And what Chandra said is that, when we were together in London, that the direction and velocity of an organization's trajectory is what matters, not just its starting point. So if we were to compare our starting points, if I'm compared against a legal company or whatever, clearly our emissions are going to be very, very different. We're an oil and gas company today. We're transforming ourselves to an integrated energy company. But what matters is not that necessarily. It is the direction that we're taking the company, which in our case is to net zero by 2050, and it is the pace at which we are taking that direction. And for us, we've gone from 3% of our capital invested in the transition to over 30% in 3 years. So we're moving, we believe, at pace. So these are the things that matter. It is quite complicated. I think that's a generous term out there at the moment. But these are the types of things that we believe matter, Lynn, in this space.
Fantastic. And Puneet, you've consulted with CEOs around the world, and you and Deloitte established some ESG standards for your own purposes. How do you describe the internal business case for measuring? And we have to get back to the problems that Bernard and I have spoken about. But give us the rationale that you see out of the business world.
I thought Bernard, by the way, was very eloquent, and I'd build on what he was saying. But before I said, I didn't have the opportunity of thanking Chandra and the team. You've done a magnificent job. I think we should give them a hand. They've done a really wonderful job. And it's great to be in India. The moon landing, I think it was emblematic of the sense that I'm getting. It is India's time. It is India's century. But to your question, you know, at Deloitte, this is not, we didn't do the work around ESG because we were, you know, we had goodness in our heart. We did it because it was a business imperative. And let me tell you why. Deloitte has 400,000 professionals that call it home. 400,000. 85% of them are millennials and Gen Zs. And we survey them incessantly. And when we ask them, what is important to you, they come back with two things. climate, and what does Deloitte do in the communities that we live and work in. Now, as the CEO or the former CEO of Deloitte, if I want to hire the very best individuals and I want to retain them, I must have a credible response to that question. So our ESG journey started because of a business imperative. To hire and retain the very best individuals, we had to have a credible response. It was responding to a business need, not because we had goodness in our heart. Now, one other piece, in the last 8 years, Deloitte's performance has been exemplary. I can't draw a causal link between what we have done or what Deloitte did in terms of our ESG effort, but I can certainly point to some correlation there. And so that is why this was important to us. And I think it is important to any business as to why we should focus on ESG. If I could just build on the point that Bernard made, I think the point that he made around simplicity, around consistency, and what Lynn talked about. By the way, what Lynn is doing with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism is amazing work. I have the honor of working with her, and it is really putting out the reason why businesses should be focused on things beyond just the bottom line, on other multiple stakeholders. But the point that Lynn made, 700 or whatever number she used in terms of surveys, the alphabet soup that she referenced, and the work that we did over the last 2 or 3 years was to address that issue, the fact that there was a lot of complexity, a lot of measures that companies were asked to adhere to. We've made progress in the last couple of years, particularly with the ISSB. They've come up with 2 consistent standards. The mindset is that we will have a building block approach, that if we can get to consistency, baseline consistency, the point that Bernard made, that everybody can agree to, then by jurisdiction we can build on top of that. My fear is that some jurisdictions like the EU that Bernard gave the example of is going in one particular direction that is creating complexity that we were trying to solve for. So I think that is an important point as well.
It is. It's really a critical point. And Sanjeev, and thank you very much, you headed up the task force for the B20 India on ESG in business. So I'd like you to take this topic on, both in terms of the comments from Bernard and Puneet, but also thinking about how a global reporting standard would impact the Global South and how it would impact small and medium enterprises.
Thank you, Lynn. I think pretty much, when we all started this journey in the Action Council, and the fundamental premise was obviously to see how ESG can be mainstreamed. So far, it was gaining currency, and it was confined to a certain profile of companies, and more indexed to what's happening in the capital markets, if I may say. But it had not really gained deep roots across enterprises. So the question was, how do you kind of accelerate the adoption? That's the fundamental objective. And the issues that came about, I think, are so eloquently articulated by you, Lynn, Bernard, and Puneet. It's about the plethora of standards, lack of clear definitions, and also, different ways of interpreting and different regulations that have evolved in various parts of the world. So that creates its own consequences. So the starting point certainly has to be that we need to have a very simple framework. We need to have something that is very clearly defined. It is uniformly adopted across. Like, you used a very fine example of the accounting standards. I mean, to interpret the profit or the cash flows or the balance sheets. Now, it's not I mean, you can do it wherever you are, or in any part of the world, right? We need to get to that kind of situation, right? That's where we need to get. So that's very clearly the fundamental objective. Now, whilst looking at it, we also realize that there is a journey that has to be traversed by organizations and also geographies based on their context and their state of maturity and evolution. The quality of reporting from a small and medium enterprise and a large enterprise, and that is so also in other parameters also. It cannot be expected to be the same. You know, in fact, today it is so complicated. When we in CII, we discuss it with MSMEs, the capacity to absorb is not there because it's so complicated. You actually need a whole battery of people to be able to fill up surveys, etc. So it needs to be a framework that's adaptable. And the other facet that came about very clearly is that we also asked ourselves this question, that this whole thinking on ESG and the various frameworks that have evolved, they've all germinated in the West, and it is also natural that they're embedded with the context of the West. But are they fully cognizing for what is relevant for the global South and what is relevant in the global South to make a better tomorrow? So we found that there are areas that need to be definitely attended to. For example, there is a lot of focus on decarbonization. Decarbonization is fine, and decarbonization is something that is going to benefit the world over a substantial period of time when temperatures actually cool down. But we have got to learn to live in a hot new world. We've got to learn to live in a world that extreme weather events are multiplying. We have seen how much chaos 1.1 to 1.2 has created. Just that small change. IPCC says that 1.5 is going to happen in the near term. Right? And look at the difference. I was yesterday in Athens. I was at the airport, and the temperatures were higher than what they normally are. So it was uncomfortable at the airport, but fine, it was uncomfortable. But come back to Global South, a person who has a very rudimentary shelter, right? For him, it's not just simple discomfort. It's the capacity to survive that kind of heat. The context is very different. So, and here adaptation becomes very important. The Global South, 2/3 of livelihood comes from agriculture. Agriculture is the most vulnerable to climate change. So just like we have net zero, do we have an equivalent to see, are you a equivalent, whatever you call it, net zero of resilience and adaptation? That is a very important parameter for Global South. When we talk about decarbonization, we are also using biofuels as a lever. Now, when we use biofuels as a lever, which are also part of the food chain, what that does in a situation where food security is a problem, it leads to inflation. Again, people who are vulnerable who get impacted. So how are we in our whole assessment making sure that the structural imbalances are not getting created, which creates more problem for Global South? When we look at the S part of it, the S part of it in the West is more, and rightly so, looking at the aspects of human rights. When you come to Global South, it is more than that. You see, we live in communities which have a multitude of problems, and enterprises are supposed to contribute to assisting the communities. In fact, in India, it's mandatory to have 2% spends on CSR. So how are those facets also being captured and behavior towards that being driven? So certainly, I think that we do need standards. We do need standards that take care of, that are adaptable to the Global South, adaptable to small and medium enterprises. The KPIs, therefore, need to also be graded depending on the context from where we are coming from. And I think also, just like for the financial system, there is a very clear governance, method of governance. Somebody has to sign and take accountability for the financials. Who is really accountable in case of E and S? We need to create a proper framework and a proper governance as far as that is concerned. So these are some of the thoughts that came in the ESG. It's a lot of, it really takes us back, because from thinking about how to accelerate adoption, we're really coming back to the starting point on how do we start this whole journey. I think the stuff that's happening in ISB, etc., conceptually in the right direction. But I think we have to also see that it takes care of some of the facets that were articulated in the Action Council. Thank you.
That's so interesting, and when you talk like that, it really dovetails very obviously into Bernard's point on simplicity, because if you're trying to do something that SMEs and the Global South can accommodate, you can't live with what we read in Europe, coming out of Europe. But Arun, I'd like to turn to you, because Sanjeev used the word, adoption, adaptation. And that's your area, and how technology and innovation and adaptation can be accounted for and not restricted by standards and reporting.
Well, first of all, and thank you for your fearless leadership on this panel. I just want to, if you don't mind, just take this opportunity to thank Chandra for inviting me, and to the CII team and the whole team for putting just a fantastic event out here. I also want to reflect a little bit, which has been said, but I want to put that in the context of something bigger. As someone who was born and brought up out here, went through college, high school just a few miles away, and college out here, I mean, I can't tell you how proud I feel about the landing on the moon. It's a milestone, and I just want to put that in the context of the period that happened in the United States when this happened. And this goes back to the 1960s, in fact 1958 when NASA was created, 1962 when President Kennedy challenged the nation to go to the moon, return safely within the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And it's an organizing principle to do something bigger. And if you look at that time, there was a time where it was not just the Apollo mission. There was also DARPA that got created. Without DARPA, a government agency, there would be no internet today. It started network distributed computing. And that was on the government side. On the private sector side, there was Bell Laboratories, Bell Labs, that where cellular communication, wireless communication, satellite communication, laser was invented in the 1960s. The fiber optic communication started. It created the foundation of innovation, through innovation, the foundation for the information age. Everything that we see here today has some roots in that time. And I think the landing of the moon for India seems like it is that period of time combined with the digital thing, Chandra, that you talked about on also standards. The India Stack is a set of protocols that were created that fostered innovation, that is fostering innovation in the private sector by making some public good. And I think it is a very important lesson to be taken in the combination and the timing that we are seeing. I think it harkens a future that I think is very bright. And I'm optimistic about this. And the reason that is so important right now is that the transition we're talking about, notwithstanding some of the things that you mentioned, Bernard, the transition is something that the world has never done before at this scale. And it is, if we just look at the tectonic shift that the automobile industry is going through, right? If there's an auto company that does not have an electrification strategy, it will be left behind. And that is, after 100 years of the auto industry, it is a tectonic shift. And I think we are going to see those tectonic shifts in many other, in fact, all industries will go through that. And when you look at that period of the next 20 years, which is probably one of the most important 2 decades that we're entering right now, we have to figure out not just the standards, but other things that fosters that innovation. Innovation in technology. I've heard a lot of innovation on finance out here, but that combined with technology and policy innovation from the government that gives the long-term signal for the industry to adapt and to really optimize around those critically important, and innovation and governance that we saw, or that we heard of yesterday. So I think this period of innovation, if the standards and protocols that are created kills the innovation, we are in trouble. And I think, Bernard, that's what we're referring to. And I just go back to what Sanjay was saying, that yes, there is a lot of focus on decarbonization. It's not an either or, but and. That we have to look at the adaptation side as well, because decarbonization is a business imperative right now, and the impact of that on the world is going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. The adaptation issues are today, and it is food security, it is water security, it is how do you manage heat waves and humidity waves, and so those issues, I hope, I'm not an expert on standards, but I hope there are standards and protocols that are created that fosters innovation to solve those.
Can I jump in here for a second? You know, it's always sexy to talk about technological innovation and the financial aspect of it. Standards will, if you don't get this right, it will kill it. It's what he read at the start of this. I mean, if it impairs BP's ability to invest and invest without fear that they're going to be sued, with what you just read is just impossible to implement. That's why getting standards right and getting something that is consistent, simple across the globe is so important.
Len, maybe I can add to that. I think it is important, because what we don't want to do here is end up with all of this stuff is well-intentioned, no question about it. What we have to guard against is unintended consequences. And let me give you an example that I hope will illustrate this. So in the United States, 70% of freight travels by road, 70%. We recently bought a company in America called Travel Centers of America. It is basically a network of truck stops, 25-acre sites, 280 of them in 44 states across the United States. That company sells 150,000 barrels a day of fuel, of which 90% is diesel, okay? Now, we think that this is a fantastic investment for our company, which is why we bought them. We think we can improve it, we think we can make it better, so on and so forth. Additionally, today we manufacture biodiesel at our refinery in Washington State. We just bought a company that produces biogas that can be used for transportation called Archaea in the United States. We have an electrification brand called Pulse, and we are developing hydrogen, which could ultimately be used in trucking. We have the products that can help America decarbonize its trucking industry over the next 20 or 30 years, what they are desperate to do. What we didn't have is the physical infrastructure to sell the products. We have the ambition to become net zero. We have the scale, the balance sheet, the products. What we didn't have is the sites. Now we have that. But in buying those sites, our Scope 3 emissions will go up. They will go up materially in the next year or two. So a reporting standard that somehow guides you to have a set of emissions that are going down may not be the best thing for the planet, because I would argue quite strongly that us owning that company is going to lead to a much better outcome for emissions from trucking in North America than the company that owns them today. They're a good company, but they just they don't have our scale, they don't have the balance sheet, they don't have the ambition. It's a different company. So these are the reasons why, as Punit said, these things do matter, quite frankly, and they matter materially, which is why Len wanted to do a panel on it, because we're all trying to do the same thing, which is have this energy transition happen as fast as possible. And believe me, at BP, we are as I say, all in on that. What we don't want to do is put hurdles in our way that make sense maybe in a spreadsheet, but don't make sense in reality. And that's what we're trying to guard against, to make sure that the things that you want, and all of us on the panel want, actually get to happen.
Lynn, can I just jump in with a quick comment? Yes. So these are very valid points, that the standard should not come in the way of innovation. Right? I think what we need to recognize is that the whole journey is going to evolve. The standards that we might see it in a way today may not be so appropriate tomorrow, and not maybe even less appropriate day after tomorrow. Right? So it has to be a dynamic evolution. So it has to be a mechanism where this is reviewed and this is dynamically updated, and even the regulators ultimately will have to have that kind of capacity to be able to do it. Because we are down a path that's been uncharted. It's very difficult for us to predict today what criteria we set today and what unintended consequence it will have tomorrow. But we must be dynamic and agile to it. I think similarly, the accounting standards evolved over a period of time to deal with issues. So it has to be a dynamic document. And what I think we need to be mindful of is, I think, Bernard, you made the point, is about the velocity and trajectory. That's most important than just the absolute figures.
Absolutely. And Sanjeev, you spoke about regulators having the capability to respond to changes in innovation or changes in market, so that standards that are established are useful for the objective. And Arun, you talked about how the Moon program here and in America in the 60s led to and will lead to great innovation, and how government actually was enabled in those cases. Government did good things, and we need to have a government with more capabilities. And one of the things that the Council for Inclusive Capitalism does with giants of industry is we go in front of governments and we try to bring the sides together. We're not business opposed to government. And government should not be opposed to business. But that requires a level of trust. So, maybe I can bring people a little bit inside of what happened with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism when we talked about standards with the head of the ISSB. That's the International Sustainable Standards Board, which was established to create standards that are simple but also meaningful. And in that iteration, members, and Chandra was there, we were able to talk about the really important topic that Bernard brought up about, on the decarbonization question, it's not where you are today, it's where you're going and how fast you're getting there. And for the investment community, we want to invest in those companies that are getting there the fastest possible way while also being profitable. So we can look at the financial returns and we can look at the environmental returns. And that's what's really important. We need, and that's why this B20 is so important, and why the quality of work that the B20 India did in the communique is so important. So the communique is very specifically advocating that the G20 endorse the ISSB standards. Now, they are probably not perfect. They did incorporate the velocity and direction idea. But to what Sanjeev said, these things have to change over time. And what will be magnificent about the attainment of comparable meaningful standards will be that we'll establish more trust, not only with government, but also with consumers and investors, that people will feel that they're able to see progress. And that is very important. And it brings me to another problem. There's the ESG problem of so many alphabet soup frameworks. You have to have a huge department to comply with them. To your point, Sanjeev, how does small and medium or southern, global south, I mean, it costs all of us an enormous amount. So that's part of the ESG. But there's another part of it that seems to be more prevalent in the US, UK, and Europe, which is that unlike the understanding that Bernard and Arun both talked about, that doing this is not either or, it's not profit or how you treat your customers, it's both. You have to do both. And that's historically been the case. In America, this whole effort has been politicized. And people are saying this is a social agenda. And this is something that the council is trying to counteract. And Puneet, you've done an enormous amount of thinking about how to position this work. If we take as a given that we can agree some standards that are comparable, rational, useful, what do we do about the rhetoric? And maybe you could share some of your ideas that you're sharing with the council and how we're doing that.
Well, I think we have to counter the narrative that Lynn talked about. This is not wokeism. This is not social good. This is good business. And what we are trying to do at the council is come up with case studies and stories and narratives around what businesses are doing, businesses like Bernard's business, businesses like Sanjeev's business, and Sanjeev's been at it for 2.5 decades. What we've done at Deloitte, what SAP is doing, we're trying to come up with a narrative to counter this false, uninformed narrative that some in the United States are trying to push, that this is no business for business to be in. Business should just focus on the bottom line. And the point that we're trying to make is, absolutely, business should focus on the bottom line. Bernard wakes up every morning thinking about that. But what he is trying to do with ESG is to mitigate the risk that these bring, and to the example that I gave you around people at Deloitte, key ingredient to making Deloitte successful, it influences the bottom line. And so that's what we're trying to do at the council. One point that all of us has touched on this, Sanjeev did and Bernard did. I fear that we are trying for perfection to some extent on these standards. And I don't think we should accept what the ISSB has come up with. TCFD and SASB have endorsed that. In fact, they will sunset their organizations in support of ISSB. Many countries like Australia, the UK, Canada, Singapore, Japan are going to accept it. But we need to have a level of consistency, and we need to buy into this idea that it is a building block approach. So Europe can actually build on what the ISSB comes up with, but let's not try and come up with this alphabet soup of standards again, because we'll be back to square one. I think that's an important aspect as well.
So I'm curious, across the panel, do people believe that these standards should be voluntary, or do you want government regulating them? If we take the ISSB climate standard, and they are already in the process of moving to a social standard, and social disclosure, which they have not disclosed yet, but they are putting it in place. But on just the climate disclosure, just go through the panel, do you believe that government should require it or it should be voluntary?
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to make one quick points relating to the earlier discussion. One is, yes, in the Action Council, we have recognized the work that, ISSB is doing. It's certainly in the right direction. But I would dare say that, before we conclude that we can completely run with it, I think it would be useful to look at some of the filters that have been put down in the document. By the time the standards came, actually the work of the Council was also concluding, but it would be worthwhile to look at it from the filters. Second point, I think it's also important to recognize that these standards will become useful and impactful only if there is a capacity to understand and interpret. So you also need to develop the capacity of regulators, enterprises, people. Like there are enough people who can interpret our financial accounts. But when you ask people to interpret sustainability reports, there are very few. And there is no clear way of doing it. So we need to create that kind of capacity also, institutionalize it. Like the accounting professionals have their own standards boards and so on and so forth in the country. So that I think effort has to happen in a very concerted fashion also. Coming to your specific question on should it be voluntary or regulated, I believe it should be regulated. It should be regulated, and it should be regulated with the right kind of incentives and disincentives so that it's an accelerated process. Yes, it has to be graded. To expect that a small enterprise is going to make the same kind of impact as a large enterprise in a short period of time, I think would be unfair. We can have graded KPIs. We can grade them also by the maturity of the economy and the context of each country. But it has to be, I think, regulated. Then only will it become mainstreams. Otherwise, it will remain with a very few companies who are more visible and are worried about reputation or worried about issues in the capital markets. And it's not going to have the kind of impact that is desired. So we have actually in the document recommended that there should be a regulatory pathways with the right kind of incentives and disincentives that accelerate adoption of these standards.
And you're happy to have that required regulation be different across different nations? So India is different from America, different from UK, different from Europe? Or do you think this should be done on a global basis or not at all?
See, I'll go back to the point that Puneet made. A perfect world would be where everything is uniform. But I think to wait for that is not very feasible. Even non-ESG related regulations are different in different countries, right? So thinking about harmonizing everything, I think would not be practical. I would say let's start the journey, and let's continue the debate, make it a dynamic document, and see how we can accelerate progress. To expect uniform, I don't think it's probably going to be, by the time we will be at 2.5 degrees by the time consensus is arrived at. So I don't think that's practical.
Okay. Puneet? Go ahead, Bernard.
Yeah, just to answer the question and then just to build on Puneet's point, if I may. As to whether it's mandatory or not, I'm okay with mandatory as long as it's simple, useful, there's equivalence, it's not directive. Look, I think in many ways this is happening, Len, so it will be regulated, and we need to get with that. I just want to build on Puneet's point and maybe bring it a little back home to this great country here. And it's back about this point about, are you doing this for a moral reason, or are you doing it because of a business reason? And I think the more that we try to describe these as separate, the more we drive a wedge and to suggest somehow that there is a choice. And as Puneet, I think, articulated, there isn't a choice. These things are good for both, actually. And I hope many people in the room know Castrol. It's a very famous brand here in India. I think BP owns Castrol. And my team was telling me about the work that they had done as Castrol. You'll be familiar here in India with roadside mechanics who repair scooters and two-wheelers and three-wheelers at the side of the road. And the team in Castrol came up with what I thought was an incredible program to educate roadside mechanics in India on how to run a small business, because they're effectively running a small business, so simple accounts and so on and so forth. They also then help them, skill them as we talk about the just transition. Many of the scooters are now becoming electric. So imagine a roadside mechanic who has spent their lives working on an internal combustion engine. We've helped reskill them as such to work on the newer specifications. So you can say that's a CSR, a corporate social responsibility type of activity, and I'm very proud of the team doing that. But of course, it's also fantastic business, because they're building a linkage, a connection with that roadside mechanic. They're helping them have a future. They're helping them run a better business. That's all going to be better for Castrol in the long term. So all roads lead to doing the right thing is good for the world, and it's good for business. And the more we ask ourselves, is there a choice to be made, the more we drive that thought. There is no choice to be made. Doing the right thing in the long run is good for business, and it's good for the world. And all of our companies, I think, have many, many examples. Many people on the room, people here on this panel, you all have examples. It's not just Castrol. You all have examples of doing this in your companies. And Punit's, under Lynn's guidance, is simply trying to get us to talk about this more in a way that can build a trust, Lynn, that you so desperately crave, that we all do, so that we can make some progress.
I really do believe that's the message that could bring our nations together. I see so much lack of trust out there, you know, and so much disbelief that we actually do care as much as we care, which is why we have a website where you can go and see what great companies are doing for people and planet, to sort of increase the trust, increase the gratitude for what we have been gifted by our world.
No, I think this is exactly the narrative that we are going to try and build, is what Bernard talked about. And imagine if there are a dozen, 24, 100 such examples, 100 different companies, so we can counter this false narrative that some countries are trying to put out, that this is all a fraud and that this is wokeism. That's not the case at all. To your original question, I think they should be mandatory.
Mandatory.
Absolutely.
Mandatory. Okay, Arun?
Well, first of all, I must say that the question about standards, I think we are violent agreement out here that standards that kill innovation are a bad thing, and standards that foster innovation and drive towards progress, both human progress and economic progress, is a good thing. And the question of whether the government should play a role in it, yes, there's a role for the government, but the government has to be enlightened to do this. Mm-hmm. And I always say this, you know, having worked in the government, don't try to lobby the government, staff them.
What? Staff
them.
Absolutely.
Send the right people in the government so that when you have a standard to be created, it is done in a partnership with the business community, with other non-profit communities like the ones that you are leading. And so that's, I think, the right way to create standards. Because I do think that at some point there will be need for standards, like we have seen it as really progress certain areas, as the examples that I gave before. But if we have the wrong standards, it's counterproductive to the actual progress that we desire the world to make.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I have been told that our time is up. And again, I thank this incredible panel that we've been given, and I thank all of you for being here and for thinking about how we can improve the system for more people through standards, through values, through ethics, through all those things. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild. We have gifts for all our panelists, and once again, you've done this before, so please help us present all our panelists with small tokens of appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost nearing the end of day 2. We've got one more panel to go. May I request all of you to please remain seated. We've got our speakers prepped and ready. Will join us very soon on the dais. It's indeed been an engrossing discussion and fabulous stewardship by Lynn. So, ladies and gentlemen, a photograph before all of you go off. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for our fabulous panel. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the next session. Quickly make the changes on the dais.